Blind Nil Audio.
I have to tell you, this has been the most satisfying financial transaction of my life. That's what Donna Blair said to Pam Houston when Pam handed her the final check to pay off the 120-acre ranch she had bought from Donna 25 years earlier. Greetings, my friends, and welcome to another episode of 50 Fires. Pam Houston is my guest. Pam is a writer, adventurer, river guide, teacher, and yes, a ranch owner. She's someone who deeply understands what it means to take a risk, not just financially, but in choosing a life that reflects what matters most to her. I was so excited. I've been thinking about this conversation for years, ever since I read Pam's book, Deep Creek, because in so many ways, she's lived out a truth that I have been thinking a lot about. Where we place our attention, that ends up being where our treasure is. Where we place our attention becomes what is valuable to us. And this conversation was a beautiful reminder that wealth isn't just about money. It's about meaning and placing your bets on something bigger than yourself and seeing it through. So let's dive into this conversation with Pam Houston. You know where I'd love to start, Pam, is at the beginning. And I'm sort of curious, as you think about it, what's your earliest memory of money?
Ooh. Well, it's funny. That's a big. Anyway, my earliest memory of money, I would say, is that I had this amazing woman, Martha Washington, who was my babysitter, and my mother was kind of a party animal, and I was her only child, and she had me at well, she lied about her age, but let's say she had me at 42. And my father lied on her obituary. So now it's all gone. There's no way to ever know. But um
Wow.
but let's say that she was 42 and she had me and she wanted to go to a party, like I want to say that day, although that may be an exaggeration, but she found Martha Washington's name on the bulletin board at the hospital where she gave birth to me as a babysitter.
Wow.
And basically handed me to Martha Washington, went to a party, and then Martha Washington stayed for like 22 years. And that was like the best thing that could have ever happened to me, because neither of my parents were really cut out for parenting, but Martha Washington was the best parent imaginable.
Yeah.
And anyway, she taught me to read when I was about 2. And she started to teach me to read by paying me a nickel or a dime or a quarter to read the back of a cereal box or a sign in the car, or just daily things that we would, we were together always. And whatever we came across in our lives, she would say, if you read that, I'll give you a quarter. If you read that, I'll give you a dime. And so by the time I got to nursery school at 4, they were pulling me out of nursery school to read to like the 3rd graders. So I was like this weird reading prodigy, but it was related to money because Martha paid me nickels and dimes and quarters to read things to her.
Wow. What did you do with it?
What
The
did
money.
she do?
No, what did you
What
do
did I
with
do with the
Yeah,
money?
what did you do with the money?
Oh, I don't know if I can remember that.
Yeah.
I probably, one thing I know I did, this is funny. Wow. It's weird how the memory fires.
Yeah.
This was for the first few years. I lived until I was 5 in Trenton, New Jersey.
Mm.
And Martha and I always used to love to go to the Museum of Natural History in Trenton and to the planetarium and all those kinds of things. And I'm talking about age 2, age 3, age 4. And they had these little animals for sale in the gift shop, which were quite lifelike. You know, they weren't
Yeah.
plastic. They were kind of made of fur and felt, and they were the animals that were represented in the museum, you know, bison and antelope and, you know, uh, wild animals of the Americas, basically.
Yeah.
And I had a collection of those, and I was always saving for one of those.
Wow.
And the fact that your question made me remember that is astonishing to me.
Yeah. It's been really interesting how quickly memories about our first experiences with money come to people, and then they say something like, "I haven't thought of that in 30
Yeah.
years," you know?
Yeah.
Um, Tell me about the like, money and your parents, because 'cause you've written quite a bit about that. Like, tell me a little bit about that experience, and I'm particularly interested. I think I have a oh, yeah, there was this quote from an article that you wrote that there was you were referring to it as a song. I think it was, that experience was on continual repeat in my childhood kitchen. My mother reasoning or flirting or begging for an advance on next week's money.
Hmm. Right.
Tell me about that story. Like, what's behind that?
Yeah, well, this is the darker side of my childhood. But you know, both of my parents were employed for almost all of my life. My
Mm,
father's work was more regular, although he did get fired sort of catastrophically when I was 4 and we lost our house and that sort of
mm,
thing.
mm.
But my mother was an actress and an actor, and she did, you know, a little off Broadway and various things on Broadway when she was younger before she married my father. But she had really regular work doing TV commercials and occasional bit parts on soap operas and things. So she had you know, an irregular but significant income that she contributed to the household. But that was not how it uh, was treated. My father grew up during the Depression, and he was, you know, severely damaged by that,
Wow.
and was kind of insane about money. You know, my mother was kind of insane about food, and my father was kind of insane about money. And
Uh,
he would, you know, he would drive to New Jersey from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which is, you know, 20 minutes to buy gas. You know, if gas was 2 cents cheaper in New Jersey.
mm,
Um, he was always, um, you know, he put things in terms of money, like
uh,
that had no business being in terms of money. Like, for instance, you know, most obviously how much I cost him, you know, how much my
wow.
existence cost him. But it wasn't just that, you know, like one time, I called him to tell him that my first book had been published, and I said, or it had been, you know, accepted for publication. And he said, "Well, how much are they paying you for it?" You know, because that was the only question that mattered, right?
Mm,
And I said $21,000, you know, which was more money at that time than I had ever imagined having. And I ended up buying my ranch with it. You know,
yeah.
it became like the most significant thing in my life, that $21,000, because it bought me my 120-acre ranch that I have loved for the last 35 years. But his only response was, "Do you know that Wayne Newton is the highest paid performer in the free world?" That's was his response.
Wow. Wow.
um and and you know, he would, you know, he could take a conversation that was about like who cut the grass less or last, or you know, really what our weekend plans were because of the weather forecast, into a monetary equation. He could turn anything into a
Mm,
monetary equation, and
mm,
how he was getting cheated, sort of. And
mm,
so My mother and I, lived in fear of his wrath about money, even though she was getting checks. There were many years where she made more than he did because she had a
Wow.
great year, but she would always like turn the money over to him, but she would also lie. And she would, if she got a big residual check, like in the thousands, she would have to just turn it over to him. But if she got some little one because an older commercial got played 15 times and it was a
Right.
check for $215, she would cash it and she would hide the
Wow.
money, and then we could go buy new shoes, or we could go buy a new winter coat for me, or
Wow.
and she sewed our clothes mostly, so we could go buy some fabric and some patterns. But it was always an ordeal of hiding. It
Wow.
was always like,
Yeah.
and if any of us admitted that we had spent money, or if he noticed I had a new coat, or um, there was always a giant argument. And he gave her, okay, so I was born in 62. I lived in the house until roughly 80, 79. Um, I don't know what the inflation rate was over that period,
Right.
but he gave her $200 to last 2 weeks
Wow.
for all the food, all the household expenses, her own gas, like everything, her car expenses. $200 every two
Wow.
weeks for that entire time. Never got a raise.
Wow.
And
Of her own money, essentially.
of her own money,
Yeah.
a tiny percentage of her own money.
Well, I'm really curious, just backing up a little bit. You use the word catastrophically, and then real quickly the idea of like losing a house.
Mm.
I mean, do you remember that?
Oh, yes. No, it's a story too.
Yeah.
So my dad lost his job suddenly from a company called De La Valve in New Jersey. And we lost, I mean, we didn't lose our house over time. The way I remember it is just we packed everything up for a new start and, sold the house, or I don't know. It wasn't like we were evicted.
Right.
That isn't what happened.
Yep.
But we packed everything up and drove to California because my father decided that, and he did work all the time. My father worked all the time. And this was like a vacation. This was like an opportunity. We were couching it as an opportunity. And he had some interviews kind of across the country. So we didn't know where we were going to end up, right? We put
Mm.
everything in storage. We got in the car. We drove to California. We had a certain amount of money to last until he found another job.
Mm.
But then we went to Las Vegas because yeah, right.
Yeah.
Because my mother used to work in Las Vegas as a showgirl and she had friends there.
Wow.
And so we went to Las Vegas like as a way to stay at a hotel with a pool, and be in the sun or whatever. And long story short, one very early morning, my mother wakes me up. I'm 5, okay? I'm
Wow.
5.
Wow.
My mother wakes me up and says, "Go down to the casino and get your father." And I went down in my little 5-year-old padded pajamas, no doubt, to the casino. And my father was just like sitting there in the corner, all bedraggled with a drink and, a free drink in his hand.
Right. Right.
And I took his hand and I took him up to the room,
Wow.
and he had lost everything, he had lost everything, you know, and
Wow.
everything.
Yeah.
And so now we're in Las Vegas with no money. And so my mom went to her friend who owned a casino, or something, managed a casino, and borrowed money because he had promised to take me to Disneyland. And my mother was like, "You're going to take that kid to Disneyland." And so my mother borrowed the money from her friend to get us to Disneyland and
Wow.
then to get us to the next couple of interviews. And he almost took a job in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, or he was almost offered it. Maybe he wasn't ultimately offered it. I don't remember, but it seemed possible we would live in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. And I think a lot about that, like who I'd be if that's what
Yeah.
had happened.
Yeah.
But then he got this job offer back in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which was practically home.
Yeah.
And then he worked there until he retired. So,
Wow.
but
Wow.
it was
What
the
a
Las
dream.
Vegas moment is really seared. And I don't remember a lot of things about early childhood, but I sure remember that casino.
Wow. Yeah, it was pretty obvious when you started talking about it. What do you make of that now? That experience?
Well, I'm always looking for ways to feel good about my father. So he did take me to Disneyland. And
Yeah.
I think that's something, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, my mom was the one who got the money, but still, um,
Yeah.
you know, my father always said, and this is, at the heart of my relationship to money,
Mm.
which is very different than his, I think, I hope.
Yeah.
Um, my father said he was so unhappy. He was unhappy, and he talked about his unhappiness a lot. And he said he would be less miserable and less mean, because he knew he was mean and said
Mm.
so. He would be less miserable and less mean if he had ever made $1 million.
Wow.
And um, and I thought, well, he has made $1 million, just not all at one time.
Right. Right.
You
Right.
know,
Right.
like where's the cutoff? He
Right.
made, I don't know, he made 80,000 a year or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't remember numbers now
Yeah.
because the times have changed, but he made what would have probably be the equivalent to 80 or $100,000 a year now, whatever that was. So, if you put enough years together, it's a million. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how he thought he was going to make $1 million, because like he wasn't an inventor, he wasn't an artist, he wasn't a sports person. Like he
Right.
worked, for companies as a financial consultant. Like how was he ever going to make $1 million?
Yeah.
Or do you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
that was his excuse for all of his bad behavior.
Wow.
Was that he never made $1 million, and he was obsessed with people who did make $1 million. Like he loved to watch golf on TV, but it was always about the size of the purse, and that even the person who came in fourth got $250,000, whatever. And that, like, he was obsessed with people receiving large amounts of money. And we're back to the Wayne Newton, like his only response
Right.
to me
Right.
being published as a, emerging writer was to say Wayne Newton is the highest paid performer in the free world.
Yeah.
Whatever free world means in that sentence, I don't know, but those are the words he said.
Right. Right. When you say it's at the core of your relationship with money, were you referring to I would be less mean or less happy if I made $1 million?
I just mean because of how he let money
Mm.
rule him
Mm.
and decide whether he was going to have a good day or
Mm.
not.
Mm. Yeah.
Mostly not.
Right.
I just decided very young that would not be me, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also, my mother, I said my mother was obsessed with food. My mother was so obsessed with food. She starved herself her entire life. And and she was obsessed with her looks and aging and facelifts. She had so many facelifts. So like these were the two things that I was determined not
To worry
to
about.
make my life about. I was
Yeah.
not going to make my life about making money, or not making my happiness contingent on making money.
Yeah.
And I was not going to make my happiness contingent on being beautiful or
Yeah.
looking good or
Yeah.
young or thin.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing all that. We'll be right back with more from 50 Fires. Welcome back to 50 Fires. I'd be curious. I'd love to talk to you a little bit about, as we sort of switch gears, I want to talk a little bit about adventure and outdoors. Because I'm kind of wondering if you can help me reason through something. So I grew up in a resort town. I mean, at the time, it was transitioning from mining and dairy farming to resort. So Park City, Utah, long before it was a world renowned ski location, long before the Olympics. And I've always wanted, now that we're back here, I recently had a conversation with one of the old fellas that were, one of the original dairy farmers. And he's still a little bit actually upset about the name of one of our communities. One of the communities is called Snyderville. And he's like, Snyderville, the Snyders were part-timers. Like, this should be named, and he would insert his last name, which I'll just not mention. But he has these big giant fingers, older, but his fingers are still the fingers of a dairyman. And I asked him once, like, do you think, because we raising our kids here, this had become an Olympic town, and all the kids mountain bike race and Nordic ski, and those are things I grew up loving. And so our kids did that. It wasn't optional, right? Like, you're going to Nordic ski. And I remember asking this old dairyman if because I used to threaten my kids every once in a while. I was like, if you guys don't get your homework done, or you don't go to Nordic, or I'm going to get a cow, right? Like, and it's going to be in the backyard. And at 5 a.m, you're going to have to get up. And they were always, I was joking, but they would always just roll their eyes at me. So I asked this old dairyman if he thought that this generation of parents was missing something. And he said, are we missing out? Like, our kids work really hard, but the work is, Nordic skiing, school, piano, that kind of stuff. And I asked him if he thought we were missing out, and he just raised his big, milk hands and said, he was like, absolutely. And I'm curious about your experience, because you've lived, like, first of all, making a living as a writer. You've enjoyed being a river guide and skiing a lot, and you own the ranch and that kind of work. How would you react to my dairyman's friend's response? How do you think about the nature of work?
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm not like your dairyman. I have
Sure.
I have a hobby farm, and
Yeah, but it's not no work.
It's not no work, but my living doesn't depend on it. And I
Sure.
think that's really crucial to
That's
this
it. Yeah, you're right.
conversation.
Yep.
You know, if my sheep die, if a bear comes and kills a bunch of my sheep, which has happened to me, it doesn't mean that I can't make my mortgage payment, and I think that's really different. I think if you're in relationship to the land in a way that it literally sustains you, that is a deeper and more powerful and more meaningful relationship than your kids have, or than I have, although I have a bit of it. And I'm about to build a 22-foot geodesic dome greenhouse to get a little more of it, like, I want to grow my own food, which is almost impossible, as you know, at 9,000 feet, but I've found a way, I think, that's going to work. So I love being surrounded by animals. I love the repetition of the morning chores. There's nothing maybe in the world I love more than going outside and throwing hay on a 10 below morning and listening to those horses chomp it down. Good hay that was delivered from my favorite farmer in the valley. Like, that whole process. And that's what I was writing about in Deep Creek, just the way the year dictates your activities, the way you have to pay attention to the calendar, the way you have to pay attention to the weather forecast, the way things will die if you're not paying attention to the cycles of the earth, daily, monthly. All of that, I think, is so valuable. And you can give that to your kids on a hobby farm, if you want to. I think, the relationship to the animals, if they are your living, is it, if you are literally eating because of them, and you don't have another way to do that. I think that's deeper and more powerful. But all that said, I think, I love to go camping, and I love to go rafting, and I love to go skiing. I've been skiing a lot this winter, Nordic skiing a lot more than usual, which I've loved. It's kept me optimistic to be out in the nature that is still beautiful, even though she's so compromised. I think that's all really valuable too, just in a different way.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I feel so much, like me personally, I feel a lot of tension around that. Like I feel a lot of like, because I backcountry ski. I mean, before this season, the last 2 seasons, I skied a lot, and I always wonder about I always struggle with the selfishness of it, and the contribution. And when there's so many challenges in so many places, I always wonder, like, is that the best use of my time? That's been a tension I've had for 20 plus years. And I'm okay with the idea, right? Because I'm continuing to do it, but it's just an interesting tension. Tell me about the ranch. This is a conversation I've wanted to have for, when did Deep Creek come out?
2019.
2019. I bought it on a whim. I had no idea, because I stopped into King's English, which you would know.
Yeah.
And I was just walking around and I saw it and I was like, well, that's interesting. I bought it. I haven't read a book like that in a very long time, just like a memoir about an artist, about a writer. And I got to this section. So the story, right? And we can tell a short version of the story, but you're driving around looking for a place. You've got $21,000, as you mentioned earlier. Your agent told you not to spend it, or not to buy too many pairs of hiking boots or something like that. Like don't spend it all in one place, which is great advice. You were aware that, at 10% or 5% down, 20% down to buy a place, you were looking at $105,000. And you come into Creede, Colorado. And what I'm super curious about is this moment with Donna Blair, right? So Donna owns the ranch, and just sort of take us a bit from there, this moment where she decides that she's actually going to sell you the ranch.
Yes. So in addition to having $21,000, this uncashed check for my first book, I also had just walked out of my PhD program because they were treating me so unkindly because of my momentary fame with this book.
Wow.
Fame is I say that sort of ironically, but the book did make a splash, and that was upsetting to my grad school professors. So
that's not allowed.
So yeah, exactly. I sold out. I set feminism back 50 years all by myself. So I had just decided, because I had had just enough interactions with actual writers, that I decided that writers were more fun than professors, and like I wanted to spend time with them. And so, and now of course I'm a full professor, but at basically 2 different universities.
Right.
But at the time, it was like, I want to be outside and hang with the writers. So I walked out of my PhD program. So with like 3 months to go. So I didn't have a job. I didn't have a prospect of a job. I had this one book that was out in the world, and it was doing great, and it was gaining traction. But as most people who are anywhere close to this business know, that doesn't really mean anything in terms of like whether you're going to have an income or not. Right. So I had my $21,000 and all my stuff in my Toyota Corolla, and I saw the ranch. I was taken to see the ranch. And it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And the price had just been reduced from $495,000 to $395,000, which made my $21,000, which was quite literally all the money I had in the world, like 4.7% down or something like that. Right. And the guy, the real estate guy, who still lives in Creede, who's still my friend, who has been a Creede guy forever, he said, Donna Blair is going to like the idea of you. So why don't you give me your 4.7% down, and a signed copy of Cowboys Are My Weakness, which was my first book, and I'll see what I can do.
So crazy.
It's so crazy.
Yeah.
And the next day, she sold me the ranch uh, for 4.7% down and a signed copy of Cowboys. And the thing that gets lost in this story sometimes, which is absolutely the most important thing,
Right.
she carried the note. Because no bank in the world would have lent me that money, nor should they have. They would have been insane to lend me that money. I didn't have a job.
Right. What did
And
she say?
what
Like,
did she say?
was there a conversation about why she made this decision?
No, I didn't meet her then. I mean, she said a lot of things over the years, including my favorite thing that she said, which is when I gave her the last check,
Oh, yeah.
which was during the West Fork fire. So the whole valley was on fire and it was like Armageddon, and ash balls were hitting my car as I drove to her house
Huh.
to give her the last check to pay her off, 25 years later. And she took the check and she said, I have to tell you, this has been the most satisfying financial transaction of my life. And it made me cry. I
Oh,
just burst into
gosh.
tears because I worked so hard to make those payments. Of course, the payments were massive. They were 6-month balloon payments over a 15-year mortgage, which then I was able to extend out a little further. But I mean, I was killing myself to make those payments. That's why you have to put 20% down.
Right, right, right. Did you deliver each payment like that, or was that just the last one you wanted to?
I delivered all the summer ones because she was a Texan, but she still came to Crete in the summers. So I delivered the summer ones in person just to check in with her,
Wow.
and I mailed the January ones to Texas.
I'm actually really curious about this because I used to talk about this all the time, that I feel like I think one of our problems, our sort of um, maladaptive relationship with money
Mm,
is because it's so disconnected now, right? Like we're so disconnected. Like I'm going to take a piece of me. In the old days, I would take a piece of me and I would create something, and then I would go to the market and I would look you in the eyes and I would trade that for a piece of you.
mhm,
Like it's almost that intimate. Like you spent this time, you made it. And I used to say all the time, like, I'm pretty sure my grandpa knew his banker,
mhm.
and I just, it's such an interesting story because you were driving, you know, 10 miles or so, 12 miles, whatever the number was,
Yeah,
to deliver it to the person who made this possible.
that's right. And also, you know, the fact that she made that offer to me, and this goes back to everything we've talked about. It goes back to the way Martha Washington made me a yes sayer. Martha Washington made me a yes sayer to the world.
Mm,
She taught me how to read. She gave me tools to negotiate the world. But a big one, other than reading, was, you know, teaching me to say yes. When someone
mm,
says, here's a piece of myself, I say yes. I accept that piece.
right, right.
And my father went a long way to make me feel not good about myself. Also, between the lines of the story I said. But when Donna Blair said, not to me directly, but to Dale, the realtor, when she said, "Sure, I'll carry the note," you know, what that said to me. I mean, not only was Dale pretty smart in thinking that she would like the idea of me,
Right.
but also, what that said to me is she was saying, "I believe in you."
Yeah.
Like, I'm a woman. She's kind of a ferocious woman. She goes to Yemen and all over the place. I don't know. Sometimes I think she's, CIA. I have no idea. But she's
Right.
always coming back from some like Turkmenistan. I'm like, really? Yeah, she's this little Texan woman with this big, strong Texas accent. But but I but so she, anyway, very independent, very strong. But anyway, she was a fierce, independent woman who called her own shots. She saw something in me. I was just a girl with a dog in a tent in the car, but she saw that in me and she believed in me. So I thought, okay, I believe in myself.
Yeah.
And the fact that I paid for that ranch, which is now, is completely paid for, a lot of it by just hustling, literally
Yeah.
like calling a magazine saying, "Hey, you want me to write about blah, blah, blah?" Taking every job I could take for pay. Um, and I'll just go back to my dad now. One more good thing about my dad. He
Yeah.
taught me to hustle. He was a hustler.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of those things, I mean, and when I say hustle, I don't mean it in a, shady way. I just
Sure.
mean he knew how to
Scrappy.
drop people into stuff. He knew to put himself out there and say, "Hey, I can do this for you, and I can do it better than the other guy." He knew how to do that,
Yeah.
and I learned how to do that from him.
Yeah.
And Martha taught me how to say yes. And all of a sudden, I had a ranch that I had to pay for, often.
Well, that's such an amazing story, especially when you think of, what's become of 100-acre ranches in the West. Just the idea of it, independent of where it is. I mean, I know Creed's super remote, but that whole idea of those towns and
Well,
um,
and I felt a responsibility to it, from
yeah,
the start. And
yeah,
that's what I write about in Deep Creek. But that, I felt like if I lost it, it could get cut up, and that valley, it's really important that the bigger, I mean, mine isn't even one of the bigger ranches, but that the larger tracts of property don't get cut up.
yeah,
It's the headwaters of the Rio Grande. It's very, very important terrain ecologically
yeah,
and for the animals. And so I was like, I had a higher purpose in keeping it, like not just to
yeah,
keep me out of bankruptcy, but to keep the land whole and intact.
yeah. And I'm really curious about how you because you probably didn't know that when you were 20, driving through the town. I'm curious about. I hear, just because of the work I do around money, I hear so often about people's dreams and the idea of taking a big risk. And one of the things I hear frequently is just the regret of not doing it. Like how many people want to do something like this, quote unquote, but never do.
Mm.
If you were talking to what would you say? How old were you?
I was 31.
What would you say now to that 31-year-old person, a version of you thinking about doing this? Like, what advice would you give to somebody else who's thinking about taking this kind of a risk?
Well, I talk to people who are on the verge of taking risks all the time because I teach in 2 graduate programs.
Right.
So I sort of spend my life with 28-year-olds,
Yeah. Right.
who are about to take a risk.
Yeah.
Most of them are not giant financial risks. Most of them are like, do I want to defy my parents and pursue my art sorts of risks?
But they're
Um,
deeply intimate and personal risks. I mean, that kind of artistic risk is about as intimate form of risk as you can get,
yeah.
for
I
sure.
mean, what I would say to a person like me about spending that sort of money that they didn't have, I would say, here's how it worked out for me. I began to feel responsible to this land, and that made me put my butt in the chair and write. Like I hear so many writing teachers, so many say, like, whatever you do, don't become financially encumbered.
Hmm.
Keep yourself light and free so that you can focus on your art. And of course, like, that all makes good sense.
Right.
but
Seems reasonable.
but but that's not how it worked for me. For me, it worked just the opposite,
Yeah.
because I knew I had that $12,000 payment coming up always. Like from
Yeah.
the second I made one, I had the next one coming up. Um, or whatever it was. It changed, but I had to work. Like I had to come up with the next book idea. I had to, come back from my great kayaking weekend and say, okay, how can I turn this into an article for Outside? Like I had to hold myself accountable to the land and to the payment which actually made it so I got a lot more writing done than I would have probably
Yeah.
if I had been unencumbered. So the encumberment worked for me.
Yeah.
Um, and it still does. I just bought a tiny cabin in Iceland,
Mm.
a 400 square foot cabin in Iceland in the middle of nowhere. I've fallen in love with Iceland over the last decade. And I had, of course, had to pay cash for it. And I don't have a lot of money in the bank. I never have because I because I don't want to be like my father. And and so I spent all my savings on this little tiny cabin in Iceland, which is the place of my heart. You know, obviously the ranch, but the
Yeah.
other place of my heart. And and man, I've been working so hard these last 3 months. I've been writing and writing and writing and writing because like I can feel that deficit. You know, I can
Yeah.
feel that I lost my cushion and now I want to build it back up. So for me, like taking the financial risk led to productivity on the artistic side. It just worked that way for me. And maybe that's just how I'm made.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I would say to a person about to do that. Also, you know, it became the whole story of my life. So in this particular case of the ranch, like I'm who I am because of the ranch. You know, the ranch
Yeah.
grew me up. It made me a whole person, you know, in the way like having kids makes some other people a whole person. For me, it was the ranch and the
Yeah.
animals. Like they did that for me. And it was the size of the commitment that
Mm.
I believe is not unrelated to the size of the gain or the, you know,
Yeah.
the result.
So interesting. So interesting because I try to resist the temptation to look back and to tell cute stories about like my own career, you know what I mean? Because so much, but like, because at the time you didn't know how this was going to work out. It's just such an interesting thing to think about, like those decisions that it's easy in hindsight. Like you've written a whole book about it, like it's easy to see how important it was in hindsight. But at the time, it's so interesting to think about what is it that drives us to say yes to something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are people in the world who, you know, who recognize the power of that sort of risk taking and then they make it be the most important thing. Do you know what I
Mm,
mean?
sure,
Like,
sure.
I mean, there's several things in my life, um, the ranch being by far the biggest one. Um, but my marriage, which is now 7 years old, like that was seemed like a big risk. I didn't want to get married. You know, I so didn't want to get married. And it turned out to be an incredibly good decision. And I started teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts
Yeah.
because I was asked to drive down in a blizzard because the person who was supposed to fly in couldn't get in. It was just a total series of accidents. And now those 11 years of teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts, where I was only supposed to be for one night, um, I don't even know who I'd be. I
Yeah.
like I can't even imagine my mind or my
Wow.
heart without those 11 years. Like I can't imagine it, you know?
Yeah.
So I I mean, you know, I sometimes I think, you know, we're directed somehow
Yep.
by
Yep.
something, you
Yep.
know, and maybe we could have never said no. But I also think, you know, I think we are meant to stretch, you know, we're meant to not stay comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing. You have managed to find value, like deep value in places
Mm.
and experiences. And I'm curious about that. Like how it's clear when you talk about the ranch, it's clear when you talk about Iceland, and I've read some of the stuff you've written about Iceland. Like, where did that come from? This idea of, and I'm curious about the word value. Like, where did it come from that you've learned to value those sorts of things over other things, right? Over money, maybe even over security
Hmm.
or relaxation, or like
Yes.
where did you learn to value those things?
That those are exactly what I value it over.
Right, right.
Money, security, and relaxation. That's
Yeah.
exactly correct. Uh, uh, Well, you know, um, I can't remember a time before I loved the earth. And I mean that, like, I mean a deep, abiding love, you know. My parents, as I mentioned, weren't great at parenting. Um, they were drunk a lot. They were unreliable. I had Martha Washington, thank heavens. But I really got very quickly, even in New Jersey, that that like the earth was my mother. You know, I got it. Like I got that I could go outside and I could curl up in a ball or lay in the crux of a tree or
Mm.
put my eyes on the ocean and talk to the waves as they came in and went out, and that
Mm.
I would be held and parented by
Mm.
the earth, you know. And then there are certain, I mean, to this day, when I'm really sad, I will go up and curl in like the roots of a tree. I will lay in there like a child and let
Mm.
the earth hold me.
Mm.
And I sort of thought everyone did that
Right.
until I said it out loud. And then people were like, wow, that's amazing. And I was like, oh, you don't do that? Um, uh, and of course, certain places, you know, call to me more strongly or I feel more connected to, you know. I mean, the ranch, obviously, again, is the biggest example of that. And but Iceland and my relationship with the horses there, I feel like they've just opened up a whole nother side of what it means to be 63 and brave and big hearted and strong, because they are big hearted and strong, and they're showing me how, even though, you know, my body is old and when I fall off it hurts a lot.
Mhm.
um and also just the beauty of the landscape there. But I could name 1,000 places. I just came from, you know, Bayfield, Wisconsin, the shore of Lake Superior, you know, the
Mm.
very top of Wisconsin, where I was for a week teaching, and the, you know, heavy, heavy snow, giant flakes, giant trees, lots of Nordic skiing. It was just, it was heaven, you know, and I feel very connected to that place. I feel very connected to Chamonix, France. Like
Mm.
I can, where I teach every year, I can build a relationship with a place so quickly. Hell's Backbone Grill and Boulder, Utah,
Right.
Escalante, like that feels like a home for me. I could literally sit here and list things,
Yeah.
places that feel like homes to me for, you know, 15 minutes. But I'm looking for that connection. I'm ready for it, you know. I got here to this little funny Airbnb in Spokane last night at like 10, and the streets are crazy with ice. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go for a walk. And I went out there and I was sliding all over the place. And I'm just in a neighborhood of sort of cute little modest houses, but I'm looking to build a connection. Oh, that tree, or those people who still have their Christmas lights up, or like
Yeah.
that's how I write. That's how I collect things to write. I go out and I look and I wait for something to resonate for me, and I bring it home and I write it down, and then everything happens after that. You know, I combine those things I call glimmers. So my my artistic practice and my spiritual, I use the term a little loosely, my heart practice, my soul practice, um, is to pay really strict attention with all of my senses open out in the physical world. That's what
Yeah.
leads to the writing. That's what leads to well-being. That's
Yeah.
what leads to these big decisions, because I can recognize, I can sort of feel under my feet whether it's good ground for me or not good ground for me, um,
Mm.
or particularly good ground for me, more to the point. Uh,
It's
like the
amazing.
ranch. When I got to the ranch, I was like, okay, I'm going to sit on this fence forever.
Mm.
And it turns out I am. Or for the forever for me
Yeah.
forever. Yeah.
So interesting. I just had this conversation with David White um, while walking around in the Tetons. And I was telling him about the smell of desert sage.
Mm.
You know, and he said, "What does it smell like?" And I was like, "Well, it smells like deep,
Desert.
deep home. You know, like the sage in my backyard." And we were driving past, and I was like, "There's some right there." And he made me pull over. He jumped out ran out there, grabbed 2 sprigs, 3 actually, because we had one other person in the car, came back in, rubbed it in his hands and started rubbing it on his face and told me to and he's like, well, is that the smell? And I was like, yeah, that's
Yeah.
the smell. And it's so interesting. Like, I can think of, ridges in Park City. I can think of canyons in Canyonlands. I can think of forests in New Zealand and rivers in New Zealand and shores in New Zealand. It's just interesting that I just wonder how, I mean, I guess you're right. Like, the way to learn to value those things is to just start paying attention.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this the other night because I was thinking about the music of Sigur Rós, the Icelandic band Sigur
Mm-hmm.
Rós, and their music is sort of atmospheric, and um, the singer sings in this high falsetto, and you can't really understand the words. And also, they write in a language that translates to mean Hopelandic, so it's not even quite Icelandic, even if you understand Icelandic. Anyway, it's beautiful, but it's not, it doesn't have a catchy hook in the
Right.
chorus. You have to like pay attention to it. But now I've become so like I've driven across landscapes in Iceland so many times now listening to Sigur Rós, like I can burst into tears at
Right.
at uh, the first four notes of a song.
Mm.
It so embodies the Icelandic landscape, but that's not really what I was going to say. What I was going to say is like it's partly repetition, right? It's partly like, you smelled that sage when you were sad. You smelled that sage when you were ecstatic. You smelled that sage when you had some kind of big moment in your life. Like, it's like things get into us and we don't have to have a logical explanation for why.
Mm-hmm.
And we sort of let that be true about music, but it's true about so many things. It's true
Right.
about food. It's true about bird song. It's true about, you know, the smell of sage or any other feature of the landscape. I mean, when you said the smell of sage, like I just like
Boom.
my whole body was in, northern Utah. Like that's where it was,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and
Mm.
and that smell up there, like where I was just riding the other day in Tollgate. In fact, I mean not the other day, the other month in Tollgate, up by you, and riding this Mustang through the sage, and after a snow and smelling that, like
Mm.
so that wet sage smell of the mountains of the Wasatch is so particular. It's
Mm.
different than the Moab sage, the way it
Mm-hmm.
smells.
That's amazing. Well, Pam, thanks for taking the time. I just have one last question. I mean, I have like 53 more questions, but I have one last question I'm going to ask is how based on all of that, like, how do you define enough? How do you think about enough?
Mm. Yeah, that's another big one.
Mm.
um for me, the main components of enough, I would say, are, I mean, the first one, the most important one, is getting outside every day.
Mm.
If I can get outside every day, that is some definition of having enough.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
Good coffee, animal interaction, which is expensive.
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, it's expensive to love animals as much as I do, especially large ones, like horses. I've been thinking a lot with everything that's going on in the world at the moment about, what a pared down life would look like for me and what would be happiness
Mm.
or joy in those circumstances. And it's about the land, it's about animals, it's about getting to see people I love. I would have always said travel
Mm.
about this question, and it's probably still true because I'm probably, if I'm addicted to anything, it's probably travel.
Mm.
Both my parents were addicts. I do not have an addictive personality, but I like to go.
Mm.
And But at the moment, having secured my cabin in Iceland, like I feel like if the only places I could be for the rest of my life were the ranch in Iceland, that would be okay. Because
Mm,
I've been a lot of places and I've loved it. But just thinking about like enough as a concept, um, art, books, you
mm,
know, those are my main things. And beyond that, um, I'm at an age, 63, where like I'm starting to see the problem with the unlimited pursuit
mm,
forever of whatever it is.
mm.
For me, it was never exactly money. It turned out I wasn't bad at making money. Like it turned
Right,
out I had
right.
some skills. Um, but I mean, not money, but like enough money to have the things I wanted.
Sure.
Um, but like, a career or fame or the better job or,
Mm,
the literary awards or whatever, like, somewhere in my late 50s, I started to feel this kind of beautiful relaxation of, okay, that was good.
right,
And,
right,
it doesn't have to be like the next thing doesn't have to be bigger than the last thing. The next thing doesn't have to be even
right.
necessarily better than the last thing.
Yeah. That's amazing. Pam, thank you for taking the time.
You're welcome. You're welcome. It was so lovely. I mean, I had no idea what this was going to be. Like most people don't want to talk to me about money, but I mean, no one has ever wanted to talk to me about money except that one piece I wrote that maybe you read that was on women and ambition or women
Yep.
and yeah.
Yep.
That was the only other time, but I really didn't know how this was going to be. But it was great. It was
Thank
wonderful
you.
questions. Thank you for your research and your preparedness and your thoughtfulness. It's really good.
Thanks, Pam. 50 Fires is a production of Blind Nil Audio in association with The Roost. I'm looking forward to our next conversation around the fire. Cheers, my friends.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in the series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Chip and Joanna Gaines, Blind Nil Audio, nor Magnolia.